All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I don't know about you, but between the excellent content and DJ B Diamond shaking her groove thing for the last 30 minutes, I'm exhausted. I'm also director of SIP, Kevin Schaefer from El Dorado County Office of Education. What an amazing day this has been. Considering all of the incredible presenters, you've undoubtedly had a full day of learning and planning next steps for envisioning, building, implementing, scaling, and sustaining meaningful, inclusive opportunities rooted in community, relationship, belonging, and the rightful presence of all students. We look forward to seeing the photos you've taken in the photo booth, reading your comments about your conference experiences, and chatting about your ahas the next time you see our team out and about. Now it's time to introduce our day one closing keynote presenter. Let's drive it home with Nicole Tucker-Smith, the founder and CEO of LessonCast, a global authority on universal design for learning, and author of Supercharge Your Professional Learning, 40 Concrete Strategies to Improve Adult Learning. At LessonCast, she leads a team of expert facilitators who guide systemic implementation of UDL, diverse representation in curriculum, and impactful professional development. Ms. Tucker-Smith also leads the Jumpstart PD Network, hosts the podcast Did We Learn Anything? And offers materials that promote representation and educator wellness on diversedecor.store. In addition, Nicole co-chairs the UDL Rising to Equity Initiative and is currently focusing on updating the UDL Guidelines 3.0. Nicole is a former teacher, supervisor of parent support services, principal, and system-wide coordinator of professional development for the Baltimore County Public Schools. And if that's not enough, she is also a faculty member for the Johns Hopkins University School of Education. It is with great pleasure that I introduce you all to Nicole Tucker-Smith. Nicole?
Thank you so much, Kevin. I am honored to be here today. I'm going to take a moment to share my screen here and continue this amazing conference that you're having. And I'm so honored to be a part of this conversation around driving inclusion. This idea of how do we shift beliefs into action? And so what I'm going to share with you today as we close out day one are key steps to disrupt ableism and strengthen belonging. Now, I'm not going to spend too much time with background information because honestly, I think Kevin said everything. Kevin said it all. But I want to highlight two aspects of some of my work that I've done in the past. In March of 2021, I had an article published in Educational Leadership called The Illusion of Equity PD. And the impetus for me writing that article was from 2020, when equity became somewhat of a buzzword. I saw a lot of people applying equity concepts to professional development in a way that was not actually moving the needle forward. So if we want to drive inclusion, right? If we want to drive inclusive practices, how do we provide professional learning in a way that actually makes a difference? And one of the key points that I highlighted in that article, The Illusion of Equity PD, is that we need to be specific. So I'm going to share with you 8 concrete strategies, some specific strategies grounded in research. I'm going to give you many resources that you can take away, but my invitation to you is to take one idea to focus on, and then to take those ideas and turn them into action in your context. So to guide your work moving forward and also to support your deeper exploration beyond what I can share with you in 1 hour, you do have a resource in the materials that are attached for this session today. And there's also a bit.ly link there that you can use. We'll also put that in the chat. If it's easier for you to use a QR code, you can do that as well to a published doc. The attachment in the materials for this session are a PDF. So whether a PDF is better for you, a A published Google Doc on the web is better for you, but what you'll have access to are multiple resources where you can further explore the concepts and steps that I'm going to share with you today. And there will also be time for a Q&A. And I love questions. So if you have questions, put them in the Q&A. And if you have comments, I believe you can share them in the chat. All right, so the goal for our conversation today, my hope is that I can offer you concrete steps, considerations, and resources to support cultivating learning environments that disrupt ableism and strengthen belonging so that every learner can thrive. Every learner can thrive. And so when we think about this important, essential goal for driving inclusion, we often encounter barriers that sound a little bit like this. These students can't. These students don't belong here. These phrases are symptoms of a belief that some students are not able, some students do not belong. And in order to really drive inclusion, we have to confront and dismantle these barriers. Now, as Kevin mentioned, I am an expert in universal design for learning, and that is an approach to removing barriers to support inclusive education. UDL believes in setting clear and meaningful goals, anticipating barriers to those goals, and proactively designing to minimize those barriers. And if you're familiar with Universal Design for Learning, or UDL, then this graphic organizer may look familiar. So here we have a picture of the UDL Guidelines 2.2. That is the current version of the UDL Guidelines. There are 3 principles to consider, and each of those 3 principles has 3 guidelines for a total of 9 guidelines. And UDL Guidelines 2.2 have been so essential and helpful for thinking about how do we remove barriers to purposeful, rigorous learning goals, and how do we embrace variability, recognizing that all learners learn differently, and that is a good thing. Now, these guidelines are used in schools, they're used in workplaces, from elementary to higher ed, and there are lots of benefits. Now, I am currently co-chair of UDL Guidelines Rising to the 3.0 version, because the current 2.0 version has some limitations. So while the 2.2 version might help us to think about how do we ensure that students from different abilities and students with disabilities are able to fully access the general education curriculum, we can remove barriers like providing multiple ways for them to physically respond or multiple ways for learners to perceive information. But the current guidelines don't fully address barriers like ableism, barriers like those statements that these students don't belong. So that is what 3.0 is about. So in August 2020, we launched the process to update the UDL guidelines to UDL 3.0. And I put in your resources some links in case you are just getting familiar with this updated version. So in February, a draft version of those guidelines was shared. But I want to just highlight 2 themes for you. You can take a look at the draft guidelines in a little bit. The links aren't going to go away. They're there for you. But there are 2 overarching themes, and those themes are important for what we're talking about with regards to driving inclusion. 2 things that UDL Guidelines 3.0 will do. We will recognize and address bias as a barrier. So when bias like ableism shows up as a barrier, how do we recognize that? How do we address that? And 3.0 also recognizes and embraces identity as part of variability. And I'm going to share with you lots of resources today to really understand what does that mean when we talk about identity as it relates to disability and inclusion. And so without further ado, what I'm going to share with you are 8 key steps to disrupt ableism and strengthen belonging. These key steps are in alignment with UDL version 3.0, which will be fully released in July of this year. But in the meantime, we can begin now. We can begin now disrupting ableism and strengthening belonging. Now, my hope is that you don't become overwhelmed with 8 key steps, because I'm not actually going to ask you to do 8 key things, right? My goal is that you can find one key step and say, I am going to work on that. I'm going to bring this to my team. Or maybe if you're thinking about professional development in the long run for your community, maybe you focus on one key step each month. And by the end of the year, you've done amazing progress as it relates to disrupting ableism and strengthening belonging. So my first key step that I want to share with you is all about fostering belonging and community. The first key step I'm going to share is to foster belonging and community. Now, belonging is a word that has been tossed out recently. It's just been used a lot. And I want to share with you a definition of belonging that I find useful. That belonging is somewhere I want to be and where they want me to. So when we say we want belonging in schools, students have to want to be there, and the community of that school wants them there too. And so that's one of the things we want to cultivate for all of our learners, especially our students with disabilities. And so when we think about what are actionable ways, right? We're shifting beliefs into action. What are actionable ways that we foster belonging? Because it's not enough to say, I want students to feel like they belong. No, we have to show that we care and show that they belong, show that we want them there, show them that they're a part of the community. So one way to be actionable about that belief is to invite student feedback opportunities. Now, most school districts have this student survey or this parent survey or community survey they send out once a year. That's not what I'm talking about. That's great, but we can also invite student feedback opportunities every day in every lesson. We can ask students, what worked for you? What was confusing for you? One question I love to ask is, was there a muddy moment for you? A moment where you were confused, and what made it muddy for you? Helping them think through some metacognitive processes, but also then being able to give feedback so that we're ultimately designing a better lesson. We can also think about interest inventories. I used to use a simple inventory with my students where I would have them either on paper or digitally. I like to have multiple representations. When students are responding, the students would have a heart, and on the inside of the heart, there was the prompt, I care about. And they could brainstorm all the things that they care about. And then on the outside of the heart was the prompt, I am concerned about. And these are things that they would change about the world, whether it's they wanted to change aspects of their community, or they wanted to change global warming or climate change, right? Anything that they were concerned about. And as a language arts teacher, because that's what I was an ELA teacher, I used this because it was a brainstorm for them to think about future topics to write about. But I also used it to make connections throughout the year. So every lesson I would go through, because we kept them in the classroom, I kind of go through and say, oh, this student cares about this. I'm going to make a connection to this. And even though it was a connection specific to a student, that was a connection that resonated with other students. And it meant something, that what we were learning connected to what they cared about and what they were concerned about. We also foster belonging and community with caring rituals, like greeting one another, asking, how are you doing? Checking in. And if you're ever at a loss for how to check in, this is, I do have all of these in your handout for you, but just asking someone, how are you feeling today? Might not give you the most specific response, right? They may be thinking you're just asking that, you're not really caring. And so here are some check-in questions that really show that you care. What made you smile today? What has been hardest for you this week? What did you do to take care of yourself today? Now, these are prompts that I use with adult learners. So you could check in with students, but we also need to check in with one another as adults. As educators, we're so exhausted because we're trying to do so much alone, by ourselves, in silos. We go to the classroom and we close the door. But in order to do the work of inclusive education, we have to work together. We have to check in with one another. The first conversation we have with a colleague shouldn't be about whether or not a student got appropriate services. The first conversation should be getting to know each other as a human being. Then we can connect on a deeper level with fostering community, not only for each other, but for our students. And so once we've had those check-ins and those communication opportunities with one another, then we can have conversations around, oh, wait, your students, these students, those students, you mean our students. Because as we build relationship, then we show that all of the students are our students. So the first step is fostering belonging and community. The second step is valuing interdependence. Valuing interdependence. Now, in the United States of America, we have a habit of really valuing independence, pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps, doing everything by ourselves. There is a cost to only valuing independence. When we value interdependence, we are able to see one another as full human beings and to recognize that we're all connected and that we can go fast alone, but we can go farther together. And so I want to share with you something that I heard actually from one of our young adult board members. So as Kevin mentioned, I am currently co-chairing UDL Rising to Equity, the process for updating UDL Guidelines 3.0. And we have certain boards that we work with. So in addition to focus groups and surveys, we also have boards, an advisory board, a collaborative council, and also a young adult advisory board. And so these are young people from 18 to 22 guiding us in this updating process. And we have several student members, or I shouldn't say students, they're not all students, they're young adults. We have several young adults who use augmentative and alternative communication, AAC. And they also have aids to help them fully participate. And one of our young adult members said, I want people to know that I am not less than because I need an aid. That is important. Sometimes we prioritize independence to the point of shaming interdependence. And that is not healthy. Just think about that. I am not less than because I need an aid. What are we signaling in our schools that interdependence is less than independence? So when we value interdependence, we need to ask ourselves, are we stigmatizing needing help? How might we instead celebrate, incentivize, reward working together and caring for one another? There's power in interdependence. And I also want to share with you, there's a resource, one of the resources in the handout is a link to a blog by Patty Byrne. And so I'm just going to share with you a highlight from a post. It's a post that Patty Byrne offered on 10 principles of disability justice. And before I share with you a little segment from this post, I want to highlight, I just noticed the title of Patty Byrne's blog. The title of her blog could be read, Sins Invalid or Sins Invalid. Interesting, those two words together, right? And then the subtitle there, an unshamed claim to beauty in the face of invisibility. So often, some of our disabilities are invisible, and we don't fully get to see and understand the humanity of one another. And so as Patty Byrne talks about these 10 principles of disability justice, one of the concepts that she talks about is interdependence and collective agency or collective access. And so I just want to share this little quote here. We value exploring and creating new ways of doing things that go beyond able-bodied minded normativity. Access does not need to be, access needs do not need to be held in shame. We all have various capacities which function differently in various environments. We can share responsibility for our access needs without shame. We can ask our needs to be met without compromising our integrity. We can balance autonomy while being in community. We can be unafraid of our vulnerabilities, knowing our strengths are respected. And so, as we think about driving inclusion, I think it's important to listen and learn from people in the disability communities. And so this is one of the resources that I share with you to encourage you to do that. Now, the second key step I'm going to share with you is that we need to represent disabilities and neurodiversity in authentic ways. In authentic ways. And so when we think about our classrooms and our curriculum, or even the materials that we have in our school hallways or in our classroom walls, to what extent do students with disabilities get to see themselves portrayed in the curriculum, instructional materials, and the learning environment? And equally important, and this is what we often forget, to what extent do all students see people with disabilities portrayed? Is the only time a student reads a novel where there's a person with a disability, if the only time they read that is To Kill a Mockingbird, then that's a problem, especially how that character with a disability is portrayed. So let's think about, how are we reinforcing stereotypes or reinforcing this idea of invisibility in our curriculum? And here's the thing, when we're looking at our curriculum materials, most texts, narratives, books, they're not perfect. They're not going to be idealistic. And actually, that's not healthy because we don't live in a utopia. We live in reality. So when we do have materials where there are stereotypes or ableist portrayals, how do we challenge them? How do we create spaces for students to question them? That's what we need to think about when we're representing disabilities and neurodiversity in authentic ways. And so one of the resources that I encourage you to explore, this one's a fun one. So Disability Visibility Project is a website by Alice Wong. So many resources, but I've just highlighted one for you, which is an article about Finding Dory, Disability Culture and Collective Access. And in this article, and it's an amazing breakdown of the Pixar film Finding Dory. And if you, I encourage you to read the article, watch the movie, discuss the movie with your community members. But one of the excerpts here from that article is that people with disabilities do not see themselves very often reflected in popular culture with authenticity steeped in the lived experience. Not only are many disabled characters played by non-disabled people, the storytellers are usually non-disabled who craft narratives about disability using stereotypes and cliched tropes, robbing disabled characters and stories of agency and diversity. So I just encourage you to explore, how are people with disabilities being portrayed in your curriculum, in your materials, in your life? And I encourage you to explore some of the resources in the Disability Visibility Project. All right, the next step I'm going to share with you is to address ableist language. Now, I'm just going to say this up front. What I'm going to share with you, most likely you're going to say, ooh, I've said that. I know because I've said it. And when we know better, we strive to do better. It doesn't help to just stay locked in guilt. We need to move past that and say, okay, well, now that I know better, I'm going to do better. And it's ongoing work. We're not looking for perfection, but progress. So what do we mean by addressing ableist language? Well, there are some common phrases that we often say that are quite ableist in nature. For example, that fell on deaf ears. That's ableist. And here's why. When we say things like that, we actually mean the person wasn't listening. They weren't fully listening, comprehending, understanding. They weren't in full communication. That is not representative of a person who is deaf. Another one that we say, I was blind to. What we really mean was, I was ignorant to, or I was unaware of. When we use a disability as a pejorative, that is ableist language. And yes, these are things that many of us have grown up saying, but we can make a shift. And so one of the resources that I've shared with you is an article entitled Types of Ableist Language and What to Say Instead. And so I encourage you to explore it and think about, well, instead of saying this, maybe I could say this. Because what we don't want to do is to classify a disability as a pejorative, as a problem. Disability is only a disability in certain contexts. In many ways, the environment is creating that disability. And so we want to recognize the full humanity in one another and to try to shift the ways in which ableist language might dehumanize people. All right, so then the next key step that I am going to encourage you to consider taking on is to cultivate multiple ways of knowing. Cultivate multiple ways of knowing. There is more than one way to build knowledge and understanding. And oftentimes in schools and academic settings, we prioritize some ways of knowing over others. So, for example, there is the way of knowing called authority. And actually, I have an exercise that you can take with you. So in the handout, you'll see an exercise that looks like this. And the directions are individually first to rate each of these 16 different ways of knowing and to rank them. Which one do you lean towards in most situations and which one do you shy away from? So if it's something that you really tend to like, you might give it a 4. If it's something that you're like, I might not use that too much, you'd give it a 1. So you're ranking them from 1 to 4, 4 being the one that you may lean on most heavily. And the idea here is to think about there are ways of knowing like authority. Listening to a podcast from an expert would be an example of authority, right? Knowledge from an expert or a reliable source. Another way of knowing is intuition, knowledge through instinct or gut feeling. One way of knowing is memorization, committing something to memory. Another way of knowing is storytelling, lessons through narratives that invoke insight. There's lots of different ways of knowing, but schools tend to value some over others. Schools tend to value, for example, the scientific method over analogies or problem solving, algorithms over kinesthetic. And there's a cost when we value some ways of knowing over others. And I'll give an example. One content area where you see this the most is math. Math prioritizes certain ways of knowing over others. I'm going to tell you a story. When my daughter was in the 2nd grade, I remember she came home and she said, Mommy, teacher told me I'm not allowed to count on my fingers anymore. Kinesthetic approach to mathematics. She's still in the process of memorizing basic facts. But that memorization process shouldn't get in the way of her exploring computation, problem solving. So I told her, you hold your fingers underneath your desk and you count with your fingers because that is okay. You shouldn't be shamed for having a different way of knowing. Eventually, she memorized her facts, but that lack of memorization up front shouldn't prevent her from higher order thinking skills. But that comment from the teacher, you can't learn that way, had her thinking for years that she wasn't good at math. Now she's in the highest level of math that her school offers because in the 6th grade, 4 years later, she finally had a teacher that accepted multiple ways of knowing, that gave her opportunities to apply feedback and to grow. And so when we value diverse ways of knowing, we appreciate the different abilities and disabilities and ways of knowing and perspectives that students bring into the classroom. And so I encourage you to do this activity and then compare notes with your community members. And I have some reflection questions that you can take with you on the resource, just thinking about in what context would you apply different ways of knowing? Because here's the thing, once you do that activity and you look at 16 different ways of knowing, one takeaway is that actually certain ways of knowing are great for certain contexts. And it's not that one way of knowing is better than the other, but it's about learning when to apply different ways of knowing. And so I just encourage you to think about, how does incorporating different ways of knowing show that we value our diversity and promote longing and a sense of learner self-efficacy. Now, here's the other thing about diverse ways of knowing. When we are really committed to inclusive practices, we have to recognize that appreciating diverse ways of knowing requires decentering dominant perspectives and appreciating the position and approach of other cultures and others' perspectives. You might often hear things like, well, with the scientific method, we have objectivity. Actually, that objectivity is an illusion. It's an illusion, because even with the scientific method, someone had to decide what question to explore in the first place. Someone had to decide what procedures would equate with fidelity. There isn't objectivity when we are dealing with human beings. But that illusion of objectivity can lead us to ignore where bias is present. So one of the resources, actually two of the resources that I have in your materials, is a link to a film called Coded Bias, where it talks about bias in artificial intelligence. And Joy here, she's the main person who's leading this documentary called Coded Bias. She talks about how the AI technology didn't recognize her face as a Black woman. It was better at recognizing animals than the face of a Black woman. AI technology, I'll give you another example. So my creative director was creating a video for us, and in the video, I wanted to have an image of a ramp and an image of stairs. And my creative director came back to me and said, you know what? Because he uses AI to pull graphics for our videos that we do. And I have a channel on YouTube. I should have put the link in there in the resources. I can throw it in the chat later. But in the video, he said, you know what? AI does not know what a ramp is. AI did not even conceive of the idea of a ramp, was great at finding images of stairs, had no idea what a ramp was, because whomever programmed that set of algorithms didn't use the stairs. Or didn't use the ramp. They used the stairs. So they have lots of images of stairs, but they didn't use the ramp. So the ramp doesn't even show up in the program in terms of being able to use AI to find an image. That's where we see bias. And it's not that an algorithm is objective. It's just using the same bias that comes with the person who created the algorithm. So that's something that we have to be aware of. The next thing I want you to consider in terms of key steps, this goes with diverse ways of knowing, is this idea of diverse ways of showing. Address biases related to modes of expression and communication. In general, classrooms prioritize extroverts. We really cater to extroverts. You ask a question, the extrovert raises their hand, they answer, and we know exactly what that one person, that one student thinks. And so we have to think about, how are we addressing biases related to modes of expression and communication? Can we create a space where everyone has a voice? And so, and this is one of the things that my team does at LessonCast. We offer workshops on diverse ways of knowing and diverse ways of showing. But this idea of addressing biases for modes of expression and communication is thinking about, what are our diverse ways of showing? The extent to which learners have options to express understanding and progress towards mastery. How do we know what learners truly know? And I'm going to share with you a cartoon that some of you may have seen before to really highlight why diverse ways of showing is important. So here's a cartoon, and this is a very diverse classroom. So this is a classroom where we have a bird, a monkey, a penguin, an elephant, a goldfish, a seal, and a dog. And a teacher is sitting at the front of the classroom saying, for a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam. Please climb that tree. And then there's a giant tree in the back of the classroom. And so if we're thinking about expression and communication and students being able to show progress towards mastery, my question here is, well, what is this teacher trying to assess? How is this fair? If the teacher is trying to assess creativity or problem solving or persistence, now the goldfish is locked out. What we're really assessing is tree climbing. How is that fair? What are we trying to measure? And this cartoon is designed to illustrate the Albert Einstein quote, everybody is a genius. But if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid. And for some of our learners, that statement, for a fair selection, everybody has to take the same exam, climb that tree, on a day-to-day basis, it looks like this. Write a sentence, paragraph, or essay to show your comprehension of, and maybe it's a history concept or a science concept, or even a response to a mathematical problem. That student may know so much about the concept, but may be limited by the form of expression of writing a sentence, a paragraph, or an essay. Now, it's not by accident that this idea of written responses tends to be prioritized or viewed as more academic. There's a reason why written responses are somewhat of a default for a lot of our forms of expression in schools. So just take a little bit of a trip back in history with me. So for example, this is a picture from an exhibit in the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian. And there's a portion of one of the exhibits where it talks about language and how indigenous people viewed oral speech as more trustworthy than written words. And they favored oral speech because you could say things in languages, in indigenous languages, that wouldn't translate directly in European languages. So it made actually the level of communication deeper. The European viewpoint was that they regarded written language as more authentic and trustworthy than memory. And so there was an insistence of recording all of the treaties in a written language, and they wrote them in the European languages. So they had a legal advantage. But the writing of the treaties could not make language more truthful or promises more binding. So even though those treaties were written, they were pretty much also all broken. But the writing of them gave the Europeans an advantage. Another historical reason why the written language tends to be prioritized or viewed as more academic is because it was easier to ban someone from writing than ban someone from learning how to speak. And so that's why there were many in the United States, there were many anti-literacy laws from 1740 to 1834 that barred free and enslaved Black people from learning how to write because it was a way to limit their agency. And so here's a quote from Hugh Auld, who owned enslaved Black people, including Frederick Douglass. And he wrote this after finding out that his wife was teaching Frederick Douglass how to read. And he said, he should know nothing but the will of his master and learn to obey it. As to himself, learning will do him no good, but a great deal of harm, making him disconsolate and unhappy. If you teach him how to read, he'll want to know how to write. And this accomplished, he'll be running away with himself. And so they knew that if you could limit writing, then you limited their access to freedom. Now, here's the thing. It's not a bad thing to teach writing. I was a language arts teacher. Writing is amazing. There's so much power and potential, but it's not just about handwriting. It's about composing. It's about expression. And there are multiple ways that we can encourage students to do it. So with writing, instead of making it a limited form of expression, think about how do we teach writing as a form of liberation and expression instead of standardization and oppression. One of my favorite songs is from the Hamilton mixtape. So if you're familiar with the Broadway musical Hamilton, there's a mixtape, and there's a song on the mixtape called Wrote My Way Out. Writing is powerful, but we can offer writing in flexible ways. And when writing itself isn't the goal, allow students to express themselves in flexible ways. And here's where UDL comes in. One of the core ideas of universal design for learning is to be clear on the goal and flexible in the means. What is the true learning goal here? And how can we offer flexibility either in the pathway to get there or in the product that students are able to fully express themselves with? And so I have this laid out in your resources as well. So you can screenshot it if you want, but I also have these bulleted in your resource. We have to think about how are we designing flexible opportunities for expression, and that these flexible opportunities are valid. Tools like speech to text, text to speech. My writing is not less than if I use dictation to record my ideas, have them turned into text, and then take my notes and transfer them and then sort them out and give them a little bit more clarity. That's not wrong or less than to use a tool. AAC, augmentative alternative communication. It's a form of flexible opportunities, assistive and accessible technologies. We're not less than because we're using tools. It's not cheating to use a tool. Art, video, graphic organizers are different ways to offer flexible opportunities for expression and communication. So here's the thing. Here's how we can check whether or not we have bias in our ways of showing. We tend to, as human beings, left to my own devices, I'll design the best lesson for myself. So I always have to ask myself, am I designing this lesson for myself? What works best for me? Am I designing this lesson or unit based on the way I've always assessed learning? Can I think about some flexible options? Maybe I can figure out a way to co-design with students to have them help me understand what would be a mode that they could really fully express their ideas. And am I offering ways of showing according to what's convenient to the teacher and not what's accessible to the learner? These are things that we need to check. We need to check. And as we think about modes of expression, I have to share with you, this is not a key step. This is a watch out, beware of this. Okay, watch out, beware of this. Beware of weaponizing time. Oh, what does that mean? Don't weaponize time. Here's what I mean. Here's an example. I have a question for you. Why are tests timed? Now, some of our students with disabilities qualify for an accommodation called extended time. But I want to know, why are tests timed in the first place? If I can respond to a test faster, does that mean I know it more? I would say in most cases, no. Maybe in certain cases, if you're, if you're on an emergency medical team and you need to do things quickly, that might be a reason to time a test. But in most cases, that idea of doing it within a certain time does not actually align to the purpose and learning goal that we're trying to measure. So think about it. Do we really need to time our tests for anybody in most cases? Another time where we kind of weaponize time, and this is one I find, so I didn't mention this before, but I have two teenagers, and so they're both in high school. And now that many schools have moved to an online learning system, students have this additional layer of executive functioning when it comes to turning assignments in. Not only do I need to know what day it's due, but I need to know where it goes on Canvas or whatever LMS you're using. And I have to submit it by a certain time or 10 points off or however much it is. So now I have to remember for all of my 7 classes, not only what day, but what time it is due. And it's different for so many. For so many of our students, especially our students with certain disabilities, that is cognitive overload. And I'm spending so much time trying to figure out what time and where to turn something in that I'm not able to really focus on the learning assignment itself. And so, as an educator community, I encourage you to work with your team to think about what aspects of turning in assignments can be consistent and alleviate some of that cognitive load from the students. And the other thing about taking points off because something is submitted late, we never give points back for submitting something early. We're not like, oh, you submitted it early, you get extra points. It's only penalties. Why do we do that? Why do we do that? If the goal is to really know what students know, and I take 10 points off of that assignment that was turned in at 8:05, is that grade really an assessment of what they know? Something to think about. And there's a resource, if this is one that you want to dive into, this is a resource. It's a podcast from This American Life, and it's called Time Bandit. And Jerome Ellis is a man who speaks with a stutter. And in this podcast, he talks about temporal bias in a way where we prioritize being able to say things quickly or in a limited amount of time, and how that really penalizes people with certain disabilities, whether it's Tourette's syndrome or having a stutter. And he really pushes us to think about how we are using time to penalize one another and how we can instead, in many cases, we can reject a false sense of urgency and instead focus on what's really important. Focus on meaningful goals. Everything doesn't have to be done in an itty-bitty amount of time. Faster does not mean better in most cases. So really think about how can we get to the meaning of what we're aiming for, not just how quickly we can get there. So I'm almost done. The next key step I want you to consider is to challenge exclusionary practices. Now, oftentimes we focus on inclusive practices, which is good, but we can practice all of the co-teaching models you want. If we haven't challenged the exclusionary practices in the first place, we're just putting all of that good inclusion learning on top of a tilted surface that is trying to exclude some of our learners. So what do I mean by challenge exclusionary practices? Part of it is just recognizing the history of schools. When we think back to the history of public schools in the United States, Horace Mann and the Common School movement really championed this idea of public education. But they sold it to the public with this idea that universal public education is the best way to civilize unruly American children into good citizens, and they never really intended public schools for people with disabilities anyway. The goal here was assimilation, and we have to challenge that goal of assimilation. As we think about inclusion, we have to challenge those exclusionary practices that say you don't belong here, or if you do come here, you only can show up in a certain way. So if we're going to drive inclusion, educational justice requires facing, questioning, disrupting, and transforming this original goal of assimilation. When we include students with disabilities, they do not need to show up in the same heteronormative way or the same, the same way in terms of thinking about ableist ways of everybody showing up in the same way. And so if we're going to replace that idea of assimilation, we have to replace it with something. We need to value agency over assimilation. Agency over assimilation. It's not just enough to say, well, we're not going to assimilate. You have to replace it with something. It's going to be a vacuum there. So we're going to say, let's aim for agency instead of assimilation. So there's a lot of definitions around agency. This is one that my team and I use to help us understand what does agency mean in the learning environment. And I have this definition in the resources for you. Agency is the dynamic navigation of resources and realities to pursue goals and achieve outcomes, both individually and collectively. Agency is not the same thing as autonomy and independence. Agency is actually an individual and a collective endeavor. because agency requires us to constantly monitor power dynamics and ask ourselves in the classroom, who has power here? Who has voice here? Who's able to show up as their full authentic selves here? And so in order to promote agency, to show that we value agency, we need to create learning spaces for students to find their way versus learning to follow our way. We are preparing students for their future, not our past. And so that's what we need to do in order to create spaces where we value agency. And so as you think about these 8 steps, I just want to pause and reflect, and we're going to be taking questions in a moment, but I want you to think about which step will you choose? Just choose one. Choose one. Are you going to focus on fostering belonging and community? If so, there are some resources there. And just a little side note, a lot of those resources can take you down a whole rabbit hole. Just enjoy it. Enjoy the rabbit hole. Learn something new. Try on a perspective that's not one that is familiar to you. Do you want to focus on valuing interdependence? Or looking at how we might represent disabilities and neurodiversity in authentic ways? Are you going to choose the step of addressing ableist language? That might be a personal thing to work on, addressing ableist language. And then what I don't want you to do is then go and start correcting everybody. Don't do that. That is very off-putting. You can address ableist language for yourself, and then the best way to share that with others is to model. And just share. Oh, maybe have you heard about this? And share the article with them. Okay. Another step you might choose is to cultivate multiple ways of knowing. Do that little exercise, explore, or address biases related to modes of expression and communication. Challenge exclusionary practices. Value agency over assimilation. And I included one of the resources that I included for you is all about promoting student agency for students with disabilities. It's an Edutopia article. And I put a little note of caution there because the article has some good things. So I wanted to include it, but also I want to caution you. When we are promoting agency, yes, we want students to build self-advocacy skills, but we should not expect students to self-educate unjust systems. It is our responsibility to provide appropriate and legal accommodations. And we want to promote justice, not create spaces where students have to self-advocate through unjust things. So that's my little note. I felt like the article was kind of missing that aspect there, so I wanted to highlight that. So I encourage you to choose a step. And here are the resources. That's a little screenshot of the resources. Also, if you're interested, I also have a link to learn more about UDL Guidelines 3.0. So that is there for you to explore. I love staying connected. So you can check out some of my work is on lessoncast.com, although within the next month we're revamping, so you'll see a new look, but you can always reach my team and me at info@lessoncast.com. Also, I encourage you, educators, some of you, I recognize you, you're already members of jumpstartpd.com. Little story behind Jumpstart PD. Back in 2020, when my book, Supercharge Your Professional Learning, was coming out, right before my book was published in February 2020, in January 2020, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. And I had all these plans about how I was going to travel and do book tours and things like this. But all of a sudden, I knew that was going to be put in question because I was going to be going through breast cancer treatment, and I did for the next year. And so I started creating an online community called jumpstartpd.com because I wanted to be able to stay connected. At the time, I did not know that we were going to face a global pandemic and that nobody was going to be able to travel for that year, mostly. And so it became a community. It's a free community to join. It's all focused on equity-related professional development and how we can learn together, how we can inform our communities together. And then lastly, as Kevin mentioned in my intro, I am the host of the podcast, Did We Learn Anything? But it's all about cultivating spaces for dialogue across differences. And as we get to shift into the Q&A, I want to share one other quote with you. So there's an article that I have linked in the resources called The Disempowering Experience of Flying as a Disabled Person. And Rebecca Tausig is a woman who uses a wheelchair, and she writes about her experience having to fly on an airplane. And she talks about how she often tries to avoid flying, but this time it couldn't be done. And all of the things she has to do, including like not being able to take in any liquids for 24 hours so that she can make it through the flight. And she has this quote: "Flying has always felt disempowering, but this was the first time I needed to operate as a mother too. I wondered if anyone in charge saw how helpless the airline had made me, or if they assumed helplessness was built into my very body. What if we took this moment of rebuilding to listen to the ones on the edges experiencing the brunt of our inadequate systems and used their insights to make those systems work better for all of us? Ultimately, we are going to drive inclusion when we listen and learn from individuals with disabilities. When we listen and learn from their experiences of being pushed to the margins and center their voices. And ultimately, we create learning spaces that are more inclusive for everyone. So I just wanted to say thank you. I didn't put a thank you slide in here. I just wanted these to kind of be the final words before we go into Q&A. And I haven't been keeping up with the chat, so I don't know, Kevin. Now, if we move into Q&A, I stop sharing my screen, but I wanted to catch up on the chat. It's multiplying, and there's 80 comments I haven't read.
Are a lot of comments and questions, and I think we can spend another hour just focusing on those, but we would love to have time just to address some of the questions regarding some of the profound statements that you've made, even beyond the 8 major points. I'd like to start with Nicole Ward asks in the Q&A. She hears teacher comments all the time when she's incorporating UDL. She might hear, "I don't have enough time to plan. The district has mandated that I use this curriculum and follow this pacing guideline." How do we counter those arguments when teachers are working under constraints and within a very specific system? What would your recommendations
Yes.
be?
Yes, one of the things is we have to rethink time here. When people say, "I don't have time to plan," let's take a step back. Let's think about how much time is spent reteaching content that students did not get in the first place because of barriers that didn't have to be there. And so there are a couple of things that we can do that are time savers. One is collaboratively planning. And we can think about what are certain options and accommodations can we design into the learning environment experience. And so we can plan lesson by lesson, but sometimes we can take a step back and say, okay, this option that I put in this lesson, can that become part of the ways in which we do things here? Right? Can that become an option that is just the way we do things here? And so one of the things I often encourage, if you're working with teachers, think about routines. What are the routines for students working together? What are routines for students to just get prepared as they come into class? What are routines for students to express their understanding? What are the routines for checking for understanding? What are the routines for turning in assignments? What are the routines for what happens when you get stuck? And when you focus on those routines, those actually become time savers. And you think about what are the flexible options for your routines. It's one thing to think about lesson by lesson, yes. It's also another thing to think about the environment. So that's a time saver. Also, when people say, well, I don't have time to plan, but I'm saying, well, how much time are you wasting with students not understanding in the first place? So that's another way to think about it. And also, lastly, I'll say about they don't have time to plan. find ways that we can save. A lot of times people don't have time to plan because they're planning everything by themselves. Are there ways to co-plan? And that often is a way to save time as well.
Yeah, so what I hear you saying is focusing on routines, leveraging the expertise of your peers, um, co-planning, and I think one that really resonated with me was identifying the time that's being wasted through reteaching students who aren't really understanding because the implementation of options for students isn't in place for that first deep level of learning.
Exactly.
Awesome. We have another question. How do we teach students to be inclusive of their peers with disabilities, specifically students who have challenges with social emotional skills without violating privacy rights?
Oh, yes, yes, yes. So one of the things when you think about, especially with challenges with social emotional skills is, or I like to think about how one is having classroom agreements, normalizing that everybody expresses themselves differently. And so you can have classroom conversations, classroom agreements, but also when students are working with peers, I like to have things like sentence frames, sentence starters. I would often have them in kind of like a bookmark format, little prompts. Here are some things to say in this case, right? So there's a lot of, and I didn't include this in the resources, but a lot of just sentence frames, sentence starters that are techniques that are often used with multilingual learners, but also really support social skills and strategies. I had these like story, what is it called? It's story something, where basically you look at different scenarios and you have different kind of prompts to help people understand how they might respond in different social scenarios. You can do something similar where you have different kind of framing and just have those prompts in the learner space that anybody can use, right? Anybody can use those prompts when engaging with one another. I even used prompts for how to offer supportive feedback, like prompts on like, oh, I really like I value how you do this. How might you consider? I use prompts for everything to help students learn how to engage with one another. Discourse is so important. And those prompts might be there to support students who need extra support with communication and social skills, but they're available to anybody. And the fact that you just have them there normalizes anybody needing to use them.
Do you
Yes,
mind?
conversation. Social story. That's it. Thank you.
I was just going to bring that up. Do you mind if I take you a little bit deeper
Yes.
into maybe the the updated guidelines 3.0? One of the things that we've been asked questions about, it's a question that we love, but I would love to hear your thoughts on it. The guideline around self-regulation and the comments from the field, and because we're talking about social emotional learning and expression, there's a question in the Q&A around PBIS that the self-regulation was those words taken out for a particular reason and changed to social emotional growth. I was wondering your thoughts on that and going deeper into the power structure that's at play there.
Yes, a couple of things. One, so the publicly released version is not final. So emotional growth might not be the final words you see.
Okay.
That's all I'm gonna say about that. But the reason why self-regulate, there's a couple of reasons why self-regulation was removed. In application, we have evidence that self-regulation was being used as a way to make people self-regulate through their disability or cope with inflexible systems. Self-regulation was used as you need to self-regulate when really the environment was inflexible. And learners were being required to spend so much cognition, self-regulate, that they weren't able to fully engage. And so it was doing the opposite of what the guideline was designed to do. And so the idea is about building emotional capacity, developing awareness of self and others, There's much more linkages to the CASEL standards that is going to be much more evident, easier to make those linkages there, to building emotional capacity. And what we don't want to say is students have to self-regulate through the status quo, through inflexibility, through ableist norms. And so that's the goal there. One of the things with 3.0 is that we're going to have definitions, have a glossary, have examples, what does this look like in practice? It's going to take time to build that. But that was, I don't know, did I answer your question, Kevin?
Yeah. We're excited to see the final and just how they're being framed with this idea of like identifying ableist structures that are in place and using the language within the guidelines to really push forward this idea of equity and rightful presence.
Yes, and then can I just answer this one quick question that I saw in the chat? As a school leader, how do you help general educators who have difficulty with inclusive practices? One of the things that I think is so important is that in professional development settings, and that even includes staff meetings, include inclusive options. Have teachers feel what it's like to have inclusive practices, to be honored as someone who might learn differently. Like model it for adults, because when they feel and they're like, oh, well, actually, I did like the flexibility opportunity here, model it and be explicit and say, and yes, and your students deserve that too.
So good. A question that El Boone asks, I often come across a group of educators, especially at the high school level. tend to be stuck in the past. They consider it their responsibility to prepare students for college. How do you respond to that? And where do you start when there's so much wrong with the thinking?
So I have had this conversation multiple times, and I do say, and I will say, and I'll say things like this, a couple of different ways. Try on whichever one works for you. One is, I remember when my teacher said I couldn't use a calculator because it's not like I'm going to be able to walk around with a calculator in my pocket.
You got your phone.
I do. Guess what? Guess what, third grade math teacher? I do. I walk around with a calculator in my pocket. Here's the thing. We can't, and I kind of said this, and we can't prepare students for our past. We're preparing them for our future. And their future has options. Their future requires agency. Have you tried to watch television lately? There are so many choices. It is not like when I grew up and I had the dial. So on the TV. So if I'm trying to teach students like their future is a TV dial when they have all the Netflix and Peacock and all the other things that I can't remember if I'm paying for them or not. Right. And so the other thing is when high school teachers say that, I often ask them, when's the last time you went to higher ed? Go visit a college. It's not what it was when you were there. It's very different. It is very different. It's not the same. And so teaching students based on our past is an injustice.
And especially with four-year college programs for students with intellectual and developmental disabilities across the nation. We have to self-reflect on whether or not what we're doing preschool through age of 22 is preparing students to not only function, within an academic setting, but socially with their peers in an authentic situation.
In an authentic situation. And there's one article where there was a student, I want to say she has dyslexia, and she talks about how she's like, I'm in college now, I don't read a book. She's like, I do everything audio. It's not, she does know how to read, right? She got to the point she knows how to read, but if she's, studying something high level science thing, she does everything processes on an audiobook, and she's not less than because of it.
Mm-hmm. We have an interesting question around PBIS.
Mm-hmm.
How can we make PBIS more inclusive? It seems based on rewarding ableist compliance-based behavior rather than authentically engaging learners.
Oh, yes. It does. That's the short answer. And so Here's where I fall with regards to PBIS. I would say, let's do this. Let's start with a goal. What is our goal? What is our goal? We want students to be able to show up ready to learn, to be able to engage with one another. And there are going to be flexible ways for students to get there. Can we look at flexible opportunities to reward and incentivize? And so it's, being very clear on our actual goal, and do we have flexible ways to honor and incentivize, to honor variability, the ways in which our learners are going to be different, and to incentivize those goals. If all of our goals are based on what works best for one type of student, that is not equitable. And it's reinforcing the idea of some students don't belong.
Mm.
And I'll just say a lot of folks need to look at their PBIS structures.
Yeah.
Get
And I
clear on
think,
your goal, flexible in the means.
and you hit the nail on the head that if there is only one way to demonstrate specific behaviors, the question is, who decides?
Who decides?
Right?
Who decides? And we have to really ask ourselves, and I do this activity where I compare compliance and agency.
Mm.
And I think, is your disciplinary system promoting compliance or agency? Discipline at its root is actually meant to teach. Discipline is related to disciple, is meant to teach, not punish.
Yeah.
Right? And so how are we thinking flexibly? We're clear on our goals. We want students to be able to be prepared and ready to learn and able to be safe and engaged, but flexible in how they demonstrate that.
Mm. Another question we get usually with administrators is accountability. And the question in the Q&A is, how can we hold teachers accountable? And I have questions about the term of focusing only on teachers being accountable for implementing UDL and inclusive practices when admins are not.
Okay. So here's the thing. So I often, like my team will be brought in and say like, okay, you need to teach all the teachers about UDL. And I say, well, first, we're going to teach leadership what UDL is. And we're also going to focus on how do we cultivate the climate and systems, or create the climate and systems for UDL implementation. Because what happens is when we are providing professional development for teachers on UDL, if we haven't changed our structures and systems, then even teachers who want to change are going to be forced to conform to an old way. Now, here's the other thing. And I had this aha moment talking to a client of mine, though, because as a school leader, that was like one of the hardest things in the world is to be a school leader. And often what a lot of districts do is they'll give leaders training on here's what UDL is, or here's what leaders need to know in UDL. And then they're expected to take it back to their team, recreate the systems and structures while everything is going on, and they're still trying to supervise and do 100 other things, and it gets lost by the wayside. And so like actually we had an aha moment talking to one of our clients, and we said, you know what we need to do? Yes, we'll offer the what leaders need to know in terms of UDL, but it's not because they don't want to then apply it. It's that we need extra help making the leap. And so like what our team is providing starting in July is we have a series of admin modules where they take it to their team. So these are 1-hour modules that you can take to your team. And so the principal is not responsible for not teaching the team UDL and changing the systems and structures. It's just, okay, now we've learned it. What does that mean for our context? And I feel like leaders want to implement it, but they needed that bridge. They needed that bridge to, okay, I've learned it, but what does it mean for my context? You can't sit in a session and then take it back to your school without that bridge. So we have like this little quick 5-part series to make that bridge happen. And we had to learn that as a team. We're like, something that we're doing is not working when we're training our leaders. We're missing that bridge. So have a little empathy for the leaders. Have empathy for them.
It's a big job implementing on the leadership structural level as well as the accountability in the classroom.
Yeah, it's hard.
Oh, I think we have time for about one more question. Someone in the chat somewhere earlier had asked about the intersection of universal design for learning and IEP development or determination of LRE. Do you ever talk about UDL outside of the classroom in the structure of IEP development?
Yes,
Determining
and so go ahead. I missed the last part. What did you say? Determining.
like determining supports and services, how does that integrate with this conversation around UDL and equity?
Yeah, well, I think part of, well, so, at its heart, UDL is about providing the best tier one instruction, the best first instruction, right? So that's UDL. It also, UDL needs to value learning from tier one and tier two interventions. So if there's a tier two, tier three, tier two, tier three intervention. So if there's an intervention that we learn works, when is that appropriate as an option in the tier one space? It's not always that appropriate, right? So there's that feedback loop that needs to happen. The other thing I would say about where does UDL play in determining LRE is really valuing variability and valuing what a learner might need at a specific time. And so I was a friend of mine who is deaf. She talks about how there was a time where for her, attending a deaf school was the best thing that she needed. So we get focused on LRE, but it's about what are the students' aspirations? What are the family's aspirations? And for her, she needed a community where she could feel comfortable, where she could learn, where she could gain her confidence, where she could gain her communication. And then she said, well, later when I went to college, I went to Howard University, right? And not restrictive at all, but there was a time and a place. And so sometimes when we think about LRE, we cannot assume, this is going to be hard to say, we cannot assume an ableist view of what the best environment is, right? We have to really work with our learners and our families to know. And what we don't want to do is exclude. That's where you have to say, we're not excluding. We're not going to say you can't come to this general ed classroom. That would be wrong. But we do need to have a conversation about what's the best, what does this learner need right now at this time? And know that it's flexible. The learner variability is dynamic, it's ever changing. Don't make somebody stuck there. Don't pigeonhole them into one space. Right? So I think it's about embracing variability, honoring variability. And then, yes, UDL is about the best tier one, but learn from tier two and tier three. How can we make it more equitable all around?
It's like looking at the triangle in the other direction.
Yeah, exactly. Flip it.
Flip it. Flip it.
Flip it.
I think
Flip it. It should go both ways.
we could go on and on, like I said, for at least another hour, but I have to close. But it's been such a powerful end of our day. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise and all of the resources. While you were presenting, I was typing feverishly, and I just want to share a few points that I zeroed in on. You mentioned moving toward meaningful, inclusive environments requires us to confront and dismantle barriers in the environment and our own mindsets rooted in ableism. You shared your 8 steps to disrupt ableism and strengthening belonging. I hope everyone picks one to start with, like you said. Fostering belonging in community. What really resonated was this idea of belonging. It's a place I want to be, and they want me there too. We must listen to the voice of the youth we serve. I am not less than because I need an aid, and ask ourselves if we are stigmatizing the need for help. Faster alone, further together. And then from Hamilton, one of my favorite plays, a song titled Wrote My Way Out. How, when, and where do we teach writing as a form of liberation and expression instead of standardization and oppression? So good. Education requires facing, questioning, disrupting, and transforming the original goal of assimilation. Those were all mic drops for sure. So in closing, our team would like to thank all of you for attending day one of our 2024 SIP Virtual Inclusion Conference. From Jonathan Mooney's kickoff to DJ B Diamond's amazing soundtrack, followed by the incredibly informative breakout room presentations, ending with Nicole Tucker-Smith's amazing conclusion. We hope you leave today with a renewed passion and leverage that passion into action. Please join us tomorrow, where we will turn the key in the ignition for another day of learning, connection, and community within our inclusive environment of belonging and collaboration. And remember always to innovate, include, and impact. We've added the conference survey link to the chat. Janelle's putting it in now. Please take a moment to provide feedback about your overall experience and any suggestions for next year. Also, by completing the conference survey, you'll receive a SIP t-shirt, just like this. You do not want to miss out on this opportunity. To wrap up today's learning, we'd like to leave you with a short message from the Riverside County Office of Education Superintendent, Dr. Edwin Gomez.
Hello, my name is Dr. Edwin Gomez, and I'm honored to serve as the Riverside County Superintendent of Schools. I hope you have all enjoyed the first day of our third annual Supporting Inclusive Practices virtual conference. Conferences like these are a wonderful statement to the power of technology to bring us together to serve all students in the best way possible. And it's attendees like you who bring this valuable information back to your students, families, and school sites. Thank you for prioritizing this important work. At the Riverside County Office of Education, we are passionate about inclusion and creating an environment that provides a true sense of belonging for each of the students that we serve. But our students don't experience that environment through ideas or keynote speakers. That impactful sense of place is created through action. I hope each of you spends time thinking about how you're going to translate this inspiration into action. Simon Sinek, an author and speaker on business leadership, once said that words may inspire, but only action creates change. Take all you can from these 2 days and then be motivated to put the ideas into action. It is no exaggeration to say that in doing so, you will change the lives of your students. So thank you for your dedication to inclusion. I hope you enjoy the day of this conference, and I know that there will be more powerful stories and concepts that you can take back to your students. If you are here, I know that means you want to bring them the very best.
Thank you, everyone. And we'd also like to thank our ASL interpreters and Spanish translators. Couldn't do it without you. So thank you. We will see you tomorrow, 8:30. DJ B Diamond will be shaking her groove thing once again, and we will get started at 9 o'clock with our keynote. Have a great evening.